I think we can only talk about forgiveness and the appropriateness of forgiveness if we also talk about the existence of evil. Because if there is evil, utter and radical evil, then some acts are unforgivable. And I do believe in the existence of evil. And I do believe that the crime that was perpetrated against me and my roommate is an act of radical evil. It was a radical transgression. In that time and place, in Redmond, Oregon in 1977, nothing of this scale had ever happened before. It was an act that defied all comprehension. One of the reasons the trauma had remained in the collective memory of that community for so many years is because it was so out of bounds that people couldn't even tell a story about it. It exploded the usual constructs of storytelling. This event had traumatized these people as deeply as it had traumatized me.
You can never silence trauma. The voice of trauma rises up constantly. This story really captures exactly this idea that traumas cannot be silenced forever. They continue to live in the person's, in the victim's lives, and anger becomes the vehicle through which the words of trauma are spoken. Some people find the journey of healing through the words of forgiveness. For her, the place of healing was around the language of anger.
We were sophomores at Yale, and in the winter of 1977, we got this idea that we were going to take the Bicentennial Trail 4,200 miles coast to coast. Most people went in big trips, and it was, of course, a physically challenging expedition to say the least. The two of us decided we were going to go alone, the two of us. And when June came, we got on the Greyhound bus and went out to the West Coast. It was absolutely spectacular. The mountains were giant, trees were giant. I mean, everything was oversized. We traveled up to the top of the Cascade Mountains where there was a tundra that was just black lava flow. We were two girls on bicycles, no skin of metal around us, open and vulnerable to the elements and to anybody who might pass by. We came down off the mountain, found ourselves in a high desert plateau that stretched all the way to the Midwest. We headed to CLINE Falls State Park, a picnic area, which was listed in our bicentennial guidebooks as a place that we could stay overnight. When we arrived there, we realized that actually there was not an overnight place at all. It was only picnicking. I made the decision, really, that we needed to stop. My roommate wanted to go on, so we had a conflict there. There was something extremely spooky about the landscape and the feeling there. We had always had this feeling that we were being watched. As we looked around, all around us, there was nobody that we could see. And we had dinner and went to bed. Not long after I had been asleep, I was awakened by a very loud sound. And then I realized I'd been run over by a truck. My first impulse was to think, you dumb asses, get the hell off of this tent. I'm underneath your truck. And then I heard my roommate scream, leave us alone. And then I heard a blow, and my roommate was completely quiet. And I saw above me a young man standing over me. He had an axe in his hand. He brought the axe down And oddly enough, he brought it down slowly, in slow motion. I remember that he had a very lean, neat torso, his shirt tucked meticulously into his pants. And I remember thinking, such an attractive cowboy. How could this man be murdering me? And I caught the blade in my hands, just above my chest, and I looked up at him and it said, "Please leave us alone. Take anything but leave us alone." And it seemingly worked, because he pulled the axe out of my hand. He stepped over me, got back into this truck, and squealed away. I felt myself ebbing away. I felt a rush of warmth filling my body, taking me away. I could hear the murmuring of the white water. I could hear the crickets chirping. I looked up into the tree above me and saw the outlines of the leaves. And a thought went through my mind. This could be any ordinary cool summer night, except for the fact that I'm lying here, completely mutilated. I crawled over to my roommate, and I heard this moaning, this awful moaning, a kind of a wailing, a sound of a wounded animal. I put my hand under the back of her head and sought her wound, and my hand went right into her, through her skull and into her brain. Her brain had been crushed. I rallied an extraordinary will to try to get help. I saw a pair of headlights coming around this looped park road very slowly, and I thought, this could be that same cowboy coming back to finish us off, or it could be help.
As we were approaching the turnaround, there was this light waving back and forth. And then we stopped, and she was just a bloody mess, like she'd been swimming in a pool of blood. It was just dripping everywhere.
And then they jumped out of the truck and started, and I showed them where my roommate was.
And she's even helping. And here's somebody that doesn't even have a shoulder. Her shoulder was run over. But her friend was laying kind of partially in the water, and she wasn't moving at all. But as it turned out, she did move, so we grabbed her immediately and put her in the truck.
There was no room for me in the cab of the truck, so I crawled in the back, and we took off.
The call came in that we had a trauma case, that 2 young women had been axed, not a head injury, not a trauma. It was 2 women had been axed. That word is so descriptive. It's so palpable.
These are innocent girls that had ridden their bikes over the mountain to come to our beautiful area, and this happens to them. Yeah, was so angry. I said, somebody needs to get this son of a bitch.
I was in the most extraordinary pain, both physically and emotionally. At the same time, I was so worried about my roommate, I thought could possibly die. And then, finally, I awoke to the news that my roommate was out of surgery. She had lost part of her sight, had been partially blinded by this attack. I felt a tremendous sense of guilt and responsibility because I was the one who wanted to stay in that park that night. My roommate would happily have gone on.
Every day as I went into work, we asked, who was this? Expecting an answer, and we didn't get an answer.
It certainly opened my eyes to the fact that there is true evil in the world. That true evil touched all of us that night. And again, it came out of the darkness. It was just there.
Years went on, I began to realize I wasn't exactly the same person. I had a feeling of stuckness and paralysis, a loss of concentration, a seizure of my ordinarily unflappable will. Something was different. And with each passing year, it got worse. I was living in New York in my early 20s, fairly soon after the axe attack had taken place. I had these strange physical fears. I began to fear everything. My body was afraid of being crushed by a vehicle. I had apocalyptic fears. I felt that I had split into a kind of wildly overreacting, intensely emotive, even manic self. And then I would just switch like that into a completely numbed out, deadened version of myself that was just a kind of asleep, narcoleptic. Some invisible, hampering paralysis had set in. It was as though my ability to take my destiny in hand had been wrested away from me. Today, I can't even relate to the passport picture that was taken in 1982. Looking at it now, I see the rage that was evident in my forehead, in my peaked eyebrows. I wasn't aware of the anger I was carrying. Right after the attack happened, people, of course, would want to hear what had happened to me, and I always told the tale in as many details as I could, and then they'd say, "Well, what happened to the guy? Who attacked you? What happened? Was the crime solved?" And I'd say, "Oh, no, I didn't think much about him." Thinking back on it, that was a kind of easy forgiveness that I had granted him, a kind of cheap grace. I was very alone with the memory of that night. For my roommate, the loss of her memory was a gift. She moved on in her own way by being willfully determined that trauma would not limit her, and she's led a very successful life. I had to confront the trauma in order to be free.
Terri told me one day that she was thinking of going back to Oregon and trying to find the man who had attacked her. And I felt instantly that this is absolutely what she had to do. It was what she had needed to do for a long time to save her life, to become free of this mire that I'd seen her in.
In the fall of 1992, I set out to retrieve the crime investigation from the Oregon State Police in Salem, Oregon. I had to find out the agent of my destruction. I began with great trepidation. I was afraid. I was looking at the extraordinarily beautiful landscape through a scrim of sadness and grief. It was an extraordinary experience to feel vaguely remembered events come back into focus outside the window of the car. It was deeply nourishing in a bizarre way to retrace that exact, what seems now like a mythic journey, up to the tundra, through the black lava fields, and down into the desert. And I remembered feeling that foreboding that had overtaken me all those many years before and was doing the same now, because now the smell of the juniper, the sight of the volcanoes was bringing it all back. I was reconnecting to that wounded, injured animal self that I had abandoned that night. Then the sign came up, drove down, and it was a remarkable experience. I walked voluntarily to the spot, found it immediately of where I had been attacked, and I just instinctively, I felt there was some part of my being, some part of my 19-year-old self, and certainly my real blood had been left behind in that soil. I just instinctively dropped to my knees and laid on the ground, flat on that spot, and soaked in that part of myself that had fled. And when I had her back, I got up and I walked out of that park by myself. And what I immediately found out was that the statute of limitations on this case had expired in 1980. So there was, the case was open. I was free to pick up the papers. There could be no prosecution anymore. Now, I hadn't really never thought about a prosecution. And then suddenly I found myself, wait a minute, and there can be no prosecution. And this first little piece of that anger that I needed to recover started to come up. Wait a minute, there wasn't any justice here. That there was still a man out there who was, had not been held accountable. There had been no reckoning for this. Wait a minute, and it can't be ever. I started feeling a kind of righteous anger about going after the truth of what had happened. It wasn't until then that I came alive.
Murdered. I just don't feel like this was ever. I saw this warrior woman who was challenging people that, damn it, she needed some answers. And she got them. She dug them up.
Very early in my pursuit, in 1994, I met a woman who told me that she believed she knew who had committed the CLINE Falls attack. It was a local boy, 17-year-old at the time, who was well known in town as a bully. A kid, very good-looking young cowboy with a hot temper and a reputation for beating his girlfriend. And she told me something pretty incredible, which is that a lot of the people in the town suspected it was him.
I was getting my hair done. One of the girls said, I grew up in Redmond. We knew who it was.
The woman that lived on CLINE Falls Road said, yes, we live out there and we are pretty sure we know who did this, but that's never really going to be taken care of.
How could you know who it was and not tell somebody?
The first piece of evidence that I found that connected the suspect to my crime was when I spoke to his girlfriend, Jeannie. He had tried to kill her the very next day after the attack on me and my roommate in CLINE Falls, and she had actually gone down into the park and saw his tire tracks.
That was his tire tracks that were down there. And so the following, I think it was the next Monday, my mother and I went to the police and I reported what I found.
And told them, yes, I think it's my boyfriend. He beats me up. He has a violent temper. I think he's the one who did it. And somehow those records completely disappeared. I drove a lot of dirt gravel roads. And for a number of years, I went on and investigated this kid. And I followed him so closely and got the police involved in taking a look at him. This man, whom I believe attacked me and my roommate in 1977, has consistently denied it. And he was never charged with the crime. I also got to know the malevolence of my suspect. And as I began to learn about the tortures of a string of other women whose tales I listened to, nothing prepared me for the escalation of his malice that I learned about when I interviewed his ex-wife. He made her dig her own grave. Night after night, he'd send her out with a shovel and she'd be digging in the dirt, her own grave, where he was going to shoot her and leave her. He killed her children's animals. I know there were moments when I felt terrific anger toward members of the town, particularly this little town of Redmond. How could they not have done anything about this? For all the good intentions of these decent people, none of that really added up to stepping up to the evil in their midst. Why does this happen? I think people refuse to understand the bad news about human nature. I believe that people commit evil deeds sometimes for the sheer joy of doing it, because they like to do it. And I have to say then, how can you forgive an act like that? It's indeed unforgivable.
And what she needs to hear from us is we're sorry. We're sorry it happened. We're sorry we bred such an animal. We're very sorry. And the people that really need to tell her are the ones that looked her in the face and lied to her. I didn't ever look her in the face and lie to her, but I'm still sorry.
I felt, yes, a profound feeling of forgiveness of this community, because there was so much struggling, just as I had struggled to come to terms with what had happened, and my own denial for years, and my own inactivity. Just as I had done that, they were now doing that with me. We were sort of growing alongside one another, and we were all trying to figure out, how had we let this egregious attack go unanswered? Finally, he got caught in 1997 for a crime he committed against his hunting partner. I was very eager to see him finally be held accountable for something, and so I attended that trial. And the jury did convict him, and he went down for 4 years. It was a form of justice, if not for me, but but collectively, which started to become more important than my own personal justice. I decided to go public at a certain point, and although it was very scary, it was vitally important that I do that. It came in a grander form when my book came out. By giving this crime to the public, it in a way released me from holding it all myself. Could I ever, under any circumstances, forgive this man? I wonder if life is long enough to atone for the crimes that he has done. In this case, I would say no. A single lifetime, the years he has left on the planet, would not be enough.
The anger and hurt at not being acknowledged is a very, very deep one. When it is being withheld by the person that you know did this to you, then you are forced to exist in a world where a lie is allowed to flourish, if only in this man's own mind. And I think that's why this still causes Terri pain. I think it is almost an eradication of the self to forgive that level of evil.
Forgiveness mode was the mode that rendered me inactive for so many years. That's the one I had gone into by default, because that was my training that I had picked up from various religious pursuits. But in my case, an easy forgiveness, this cheap grace that I had afforded myself, was tremendously detrimental, because it had left me with this legacy of powerlessness, of an inability to resume my will, with an inability to acknowledge my anger, with allowing injustice to continue in this community.
Even as she says, I never forgave this man. In fact, he never asked for forgiveness. There is an expression already of a kind of forgiveness with the community. They, in other words, represented the perpetrator, even though he himself did not ask forgiveness. When she left the town, the reflection by the community helped her to transcend the place of helplessness and powerlessness and death. And that place of transcendence, transcending our trauma, connecting to the community, that space that is created with feelings of recognition of the other's humanity is what forgiveness is about. It's the opening up of something new.